Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Andrew Redman. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute, and on behalf of the Mexico Institute and the Canada Institute, sometimes known as the North American Institutes at the Wilson Center, we're delighted to have you here this morning to launch a book that has been a long time coming, as some of you know. This is a project that preceded my arrival and Chris's arrivals at the Wilson Center, but we're really happy to be here for the landing, if not the takeoff, to paraphrase one of our Wilson Center colleagues. So we're really happy to launch North America 2.0, Forging a Continental Future. We have a very packed program this morning, so we're going to try to stay on time and move quickly, so apologies in advance if we interrupt or cut people off. It's not personal. We're going to start with some remarks by two distinguished representatives of the Mexican and Canadian governments. It's my pleasure to introduce first Ambassador Esteban Moctezuma, who was appointed Ambassador of Mexico to the United States by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and confirmed by the Mexican Senate in February of 2021. The ambassador has a long public service career. I'm just going to mention a few highlights. He has been Secretary of Public Education, Secretary of Social Development. He's been a Senator, Secretary of the Interior, and Secretary of Administration for the government of the state of Sinaloa. In addition to government service, Ambassador Moctezuma has been Executive President of Fundación Azteca. He was a promoter of the system of children's and youth symphony orchestras, Esperanza Azteca, and a trainer of youth of excellence through the Bicentennial Generation Scholarships. Ambassador Moctezuma holds a degree in economics by the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. He also earned a master's degree in economic development from the University of Cambridge. And just recently, as Ambassador Moctezuma was explaining the U.S. elections on Twitter, he observed that the bilateral relationship between the United States and Mexico is between countries, not political parties. And that struck me as something really appropriate for this conversation as well, as we talk about North America and what it means to always remember that political parties may come and go, but the links that we have, the connections, many of which we'll talk about this morning, are long-lasting and really often suggest happen despite the government's best efforts. So with that, Ambassador Moctezuma, it's my pleasure to welcome you up to the stage.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank to the Wilson Center for sponsoring this initiative. And thanks also to Christopher Sands from Mexico and the Canada Institutes of the Wilson Center. And I really want to recognize Alan Bersin and Tom Long for organizing a very interesting compilation of opinions and recommendations to forge a North American future. I am an advocate of the North American region because I believe in its potential to raise the living standards of our people. And the great question is raised in the book's introduction. What characterizes our shared region today? I would say the many positive results from decades of intense interactions between governments, private sector, organizations, artists, and communities of the three countries. The book makes this very clear. Despite the many challenges, North America has a number of comparative assets compared to other regions in the world. I am convinced, and I think we can all agree, that what truly characterizes North America today is opportunity. Our three countries encompass 5 million people and trade $1.3 trillion a year. We are the most important commercial region worldwide. The USMCA represents 28% of the world's GDP, almost a third. Nevertheless, many people in our countries are not informed about this massive creation of value. And if we think of ourselves as a region, and bear in mind the potential and benefits that working under a regional approach brings to our countries and peoples, we will have an easier path to collaborate together. This is what I call a regional approach to development. Because a regional approach to development means giving our domestic policies a broader view to achieve a more efficient and equitable integration. From trade policy to immigration and workforce development to cybersecurity and critical infrastructure resilience, among many other issues that are discussed in this book, our governments and the private sector have worked and continue to work together to address the regional challenges and opportunities we face. It's true that these efforts need to be renovated and readapted to the new circumstances as we experience shifts in geopolitical realities. And that is precisely what we are doing and need to continue doing. As the book points out, there is a clear geoeconomic logic for the advancement of North America idea. We need to continue building on the foundations of this common vision. When we think about the integration of North America and its competitiveness, several elements that need to come together spring to mind, like infrastructure, regional security, human capital, innovation, and many others. In this context, all actors should know and understand that serious efforts are ongoing and that a trilateral dialogue on most of these crucial issues is happening daily at every level. But we have to recognize that this dialogue is much more intense between Canada and the US and between Mexico and the US. That's why Mexico is eager in continue working to keep getting closer to Canada as well. Canada's temporary foreign worker program, for example, has been a promising alternative to irregular migration in the region. The circularity built into this program, that relies mostly on Mexican workers, has allowed Canada to have a reliable pool of labor to fill shortages in key industries. And it also gives Mexican workers the possibility to earn money abroad while remaining rooted in their original communities. Yes, and a project as complex as ours will always have to deal with obstacles. The key is how we decide to face them together and what tools and mechanisms we have within our reach. For this reason, we have reactivated and reestablished institutional relations at all levels, which, by the way, were taken for granted in the previous years. USMCA has its own dispute settlement tools, but the North American Leaders Summit that was dormant during years was reactivated, and as all of you know, serves as the platform to determine annual priorities for the region in all areas, fostering specific initiatives that target specific areas. One example is the North American Drug Dialogue, which resulted from a commitment made at the 2016 NALS Summit. Another example is how Mexico, Canada, and the United States have sought to give content to the North Americans' idea of equity and inclusion with a vision of historical recognition and reconciliation with our indigenous peoples and communities through the Trilateral Working Group on Violence against Indigenous Women and Girls. We are working to develop a joint labor force that meets the necessary skills for the economy of the 21st century through the Workforce Development Working Group. On other issues, the high-level security dialogue facilitates a new security regional cooperation framework. Cybersecurity is an extraordinary example of our close collaboration under this framework. Mexico is focused on building resilience by sharing information and strengthening the rule of law. Just last week, Mexico and Canada actively participated in a White House initiative, Counter-Ransom Initiative, organized along with other 33 nations to disrupt ransomware, prosecute criminals, and counter illicit financing. These are just few examples of the work ongoing. I want to underline that I don't think that the magnitude of what North America represents to the world and even to our 3 countries is fully understood. We need to work on that, on building a name and a reputation out there. And this book contributes highly to that. As I earlier said, we have the opportunity to impact the daily lives of our peoples. We need to make awareness of a reality that touches lives in so many positive ways. As Alan points out in the book, few voices trumpet the benefits of North American idea. That is true, and we should not accept it. We must actively work together to find ways of communicating the benefits of North America to our peoples, to explain in the simplest terms how Mexico, Canada, and the US are present in their everyday lives. I also believe that a deeper partnership has to be grounded in social, cultural, and humanistic values. Here, the North American youth is already playing a big part. They have a keen sense of inclusion, social responsibility, and defending the environment. A stronger North America will also allow us to put forward a regional vision based on respect for human rights, freedom, and democracy. So let's continue the effort of building on the multiple successes we have achieved in the past 30 years. If we're serious about North America, we need to own the reality that our geographic proximity means sharing challenges and sharing solutions, but most importantly, sharing our future. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Sands, and I direct the Canada Institute, the other one of the North American institutes here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're particularly proud that we give both countries their due with special focus on bilateral relations, but also can come together to have this conversation about trilateral relations between these 3 countries. Very, very important, not only to Canada and Mexico, but to the United States. I'm pleased now to be able to introduce a representative of the Canadian government, the Canadian Embassy, Sarah Cohen. Sarah is the Deputy Head of Mission here, responsible for foreign policy and national security issues at the Canadian Embassy. She is, as part of the Embassy's senior executive leadership team, Sarah oversees programs dealing with foreign aid and defense policy, energy, environment, public safety, border security, immigration, intelligence liaison, and law enforcement. I don't know what the rest of those people do, but you do an awful lot. Prior to assuming this position, she has held various executive positions in Ottawa at the headquarters of Global Affairs Canada, Canada's foreign ministry. Most recently, she served as Director General, South America and Inter-American Affairs Bureau, and in this capacity, she was Canada's national coordinator for the U.S.-hosted Summit of the Americas, which took place in Los Angeles earlier this year. Previously, she was Chief of Staff to the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and Chief of Staff to the Assistant Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. And in 2017, Sarah established and headed up the Canada-U.S. Engagement Task Force, for which she and her team received a 2018 Public Service Award for excellence for exemplary effort under extraordinary circumstances. That's a very polite Canadian way of saying renegotiating NAFTA, but she has the scars to prove it. Other assignments at headquarters include 2 years deployed to the Privy Council office, in the Foreign and Defense Policy Secretariat responsible for Latin America and the Caribbean. A career diplomat, Sarah began her career at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., where she was first responsible for federal, provincial, and territorial relations. From 2009 to 2012, she served as the head of the political section in the Canadian Embassy in Bogota, Colombia, and was head of the political section at the Canadian Embassy in Santiago, Chile, from 2014 to 2016. Born and raised in Montreal, I'm jealous already, Sarah holds a BA with honors in history from McGill University and a master's in East European Studies from the University College London. Sarah, welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Chris, and thank you to our hosts for inviting me to provide just a few opening remarks today. In advance of the launch of your North America 2.0, Forging a Continental Future. You've heard my bio. I think you can understand why, not only having started my career here in Washington, these themes are extraordinarily important to me over the course of my career and, of course, in my current assignment, but also in light of the experience that I've had working together with the US and Mexico in a variety of ways throughout the Western Hemisphere. And of course, we at the Canadian Embassy are big fans of the Wilson Centre, as are all the rest of you. And as many of you will recall, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and several of his ministers spoke here almost exactly 1 year ago when they were in Washington for the North American Leaders Summit. And so I would be remiss, of course, if I were to fail to acknowledge once more the key role that our dear colleague Chris Sands and his entire team plays on a day-to-day basis in advancing the Canada-US relationship, but also the North America construct within the work here at the Wilson Centre in Washington, but also in making that particular event a huge success. So look, it would take much longer than the 5 minutes I've been given to describe how Canada, the US, and Mexico cooperate on the North American continent and on the shared priorities of our three countries. I would also be forced to repeat everything that Ambassador Montezuma has just explained to you, with which I agree in complete agreement in terms of the structure of that relationship, in terms of where we can push ahead, in terms of the need for Canada and Mexico to get closer together. I have had many experiences over the course of my career working very closely with Mexican diplomats, particularly in the North America, in the hemispheric context. And I would say, in addition to what Ambassador Montezuma has outlined in terms of our shared priorities in this space, the partnership between Canada and Mexico to advance the dignity of people in the multilateral space, human rights, the rights of LGBTQ2 populations, Indigenous communities, Afro-Colombian communities, Afro-American communities, in the context of particularly the work that I did at the Summit of the Americas, was fundamental in advancing some of those concepts on a hemispheric basis. And so I offer that as just one more example where Canada and Mexico work very closely together on shared priorities to advance those values in this region. In addition, to complement what Ambassador Montezuma has just shared with us, to name a few additional highlights, we're working as equal partners on a diverse range of transborder issues, such as managing COVID-19, developing legal pathways for migrants, and I took good note of the comments regarding our migratory programs and our temporary foreign workers programs. Advancing environmental conservation, and taking strong action in the global fight against climate change. We're collaborating to ensure an economic recovery that creates new jobs and middle-class growth, while improving supply chain security in an uncertain world, and supporting a North American transition to zero-emission vehicles. And of course we do so, as I think I've alluded, on the basis of shared values and toward the common goal of improving the quality of life of our countries and the futures of our children, our colleagues, our friends, our sisters, our brothers, our mothers, our fathers. Canadians actually do know that the partnership we have built together in North America over the past 30 years is unique and essential to our common prosperity. But I also agree fully with the ambassador's comments that we need to do a better job of projecting that narrative outwards. Initiatives like this book launch, the events that the Wilson Centre will put together, hopefully more of them over the coming months and years that I am here anyway, are a big component of that, because as I say, I think Canadians do understand the fundamental concept of North America and why it is to our benefit to project that and to protect that. But we can do a much better job, the three of us together, to push that narrative outwards. Canadians definitely understand that for all the benefits we see from CUSMA, USMCA, TMAC, and other instruments, of course, and connections that bind our countries together, maintaining this complex partnership does require constant attention and effort, both trilaterally and bilaterally. And the ambassador has shared with us the various structures that we have in place, the NALs. We had a North American Foreign Ministers meeting in LA in June, a variety of other formal structures that give us work plans and give us guidance, and then, of course, the day-to-day work that we do as officials, the private sector, people-to-people ties, our educational institutions, to foster and advance that concept. And so sometimes that cooperation takes a high profile, but without the work underneath those levels and the work that the Wilson Centre does and the work that we do together as diplomats and the work that many of you will do with your counterparts, depending on your interests in this topic, that work flounders and probably does not advance. I'm going to skip through all of the bits of this speech that repeat what Ambassador Montezuma has already said. I would like to touch maybe just on the theme of migration because the ambassadors opened that door. And so I mentioned the Summit of the Americas, which took place last June. And so we were pleased to endorse the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection at the summit. And we are very much looking forward to advancing its implementation through the Investing in Asylum and Refugee Resettlement and Complementary Pathways action packages that Canada is leading and co-leading respectively. And there again, of course, we're working with the US and we're working with Mexico. Canada, domestically, we have introduced a number of innovations to increase our ability to offer protection to those in need over and above our existing humanitarian resettlement program targets. This includes our innovative labor mobility initiative for refugees, which we call the Economic Mobility Pathways Pilot. Our current plan aims to continue welcoming immigrants at about 1% of our population, with a target of about 430,000 new permanent residents in 2020, growing up to 500,000 in 2025. And that's just one example, building on the ambassador's comments, of areas where there is an increased interest in working very closely with Canada, US, and Mexico as we look towards our own hemisphere in particular. And then, of course, another area of shared focus where I'll just provide a little bit more is on the environment. And Canada is hosting the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, COP15, to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal in December, where leaders, including members like Mexico and observers, will coordinate efforts to protect nature and stop further biodiversity loss around the world. Chris outlined the number of agencies and departments in my portfolio. The common thread there is borders. And there are many things that go across borders. And while we don't have a land border with Mexico, we are part of a North American construct and a North American perimeter that needs to manage itself. And one of the many things that go across borders is the environment, is the air, is the water, is the trees and the plants and the fish and the birds. And so in that context, that's not just a Canada-US what goes across the border. That is the full North American space, the full North American perimeter, and that's where the close partnership that we have with Mexico and the US is, of course, increasingly important because this is our shared environment. And then, of course, there's the rest of the world. And of course, the challenges of the last few years, exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, have only served to underscore and strengthen the cooperation among governments, businesses, and workers in North America. We basically had no choice. What else were we going to do? I suppose we did have a choice, but fortunately, we went down this path. More recently, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have demonstrated our joint resolve to stand on the world stage shoulder to shoulder. And as we look within our own hemisphere at the current and tragic situation in Haiti, we look to find ways to work together and with the UN to find resilient solutions to this ongoing crisis. Canada, US, Mexico, together with other partners. We could have a similar conversation about the work over the many, many years to address the tragic and undemocratic situation in Venezuela, where again, we've had opportunities to work closely with the US and Mexico. You know, we would all be quite naive to think it will be smooth sailing without other tumultuous times ahead. It's just the reality of the world we live in. I was here 18 years ago at this embassy talking about very different issues. The world has become a much scarier place since then, and all of our countries are grappling with that, including the North American ones. Putin's war in Ukraine is jeopardizing food and energy security and critical supply chains, putting the world's most vulnerable at risk. On China, we share common interests with our partners in advancing a level playing field for our workers and businesses. That very much includes in the North American space. And so we're on a pathway to advance our common interests and shared values amid the challenges ahead. I am pretty confident that we will continue in a strengthened partnership with the US and Mexico, taking into account all of the, dare I say, call to action in the ambassador's remarks about the need to do it better in a more agile way and in a more joined up way. But we have laid an incredible foundation, starting, of course, with North American economic integration, but building on that and the relationships that brings and the knowledge of our respective countries that brings. Partners like the Wilson Center, contributions like this book could not come at a better time. And so I look forward to hearing the outcomes of the panel discussion today. I look forward to more conversations of this nature and to spending my time here in Washington working with the ambassador, with Chris, with others, similar partners, to really advance these concepts as we look towards what the future of the North American continent will look like. Thanks very much.
with a great kickoff from the ambassador and the DCM, we'll now shift to the first of our two panel discussions we've assembled. Unfortunately, we couldn't assemble all the authors, but we have several of the authors in these two panels. I'm going to do just a quick overview of their bios because their full bios are here in the book that I know you all have. And then we'll start the conversation, as I mentioned earlier, because of we're trying to pack a lot in. We'll try to do this fairly quickly and leave time for those of you in the audience to pose some questions as well. So starting to my far left, Karina Fernandez Stark is an international consultant and senior contributor at the Duke GVC Center. She's led numerous research projects related to economic development and competitiveness around the world, and consulted for ECLAC, the Inter-American Development Bank, the OECD, UNCTAD, and the World Bank, among others. She will be followed by Earl Anthony Wayne, known, I think, to everyone here in the room. Ambassador Wayne is a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center, a distinguished diplomat in residence at American University, and a career ambassador with posts including U.S. Ambassador to Mexico and Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs. Ambassador Wayne, in collaboration with the North American Institutes, leads the Wilson Center's work on USMCA and North American cooperation. And last but absolutely not least, Tom Long is a reader in international relations at the University of Warwick and an affiliated professor at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE, in Mexico. He also, since 2016, has chaired American University's Robert A. Pastor North American Research Initiative. Tom is the author of several books and articles, and of course, most importantly for today's event, he is co-editor and contributor to this. And we are delighted to have you all here. What I'm going to do is ask each of you, starting with Karina, to just talk a little bit about the chapter that you wrote, and then we'll hopefully have some time for a brief conversation. So Karina, please, welcome to the Wilson Center. Really happy to have you here.
Thank you. Can you hear me fine? Yeah. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to be part of this great project. My chapter is about advancing regionalization for GVC leadership, but advancing regionalization meaning the Americas, including Latin America. So we know that global value chains dominate today international trade. The fragmentation of industries has allowed multiple countries to participate in trade without having to develop the full capabilities across the value chain. So some countries can participate in production while other countries participate in the design of a product, for example. North America is an influential force in most of the global value chain through its firm's leadership. The United States dominate the global production system in the world, influencing what, how, and where goods are produced. U.S. firms are mainly in the highest segments of the value chain, usually in the research and development, and design, and branding. Canada fulfills two major roles in global value chains, a niche of a high-value manufacturer and as well a natural resources provider. While Mexico, the original role was a low-value assembly provider, nowadays has been upgrading to become an advanced manufacturing hub. We can say that no anymore is the textiles and apparel industry, but we can see medical devices and aerospace. So everybody received this piece of paper, so you can see the first graph. In here, we are going to compare North America with other regional partnerships, okay? And in the first line, we see Asia, RCEP, and all the dots represent the GDP per capita. So we see this group of 15 countries. The interregional trade is among 58%, but it's going to increase in the coming years, and they have a labor force of 1.2 billion. And this group covers around 30% of the world's population, and is it has a diverse number of countries with different GDPs, so they can perform different activities in the global value chain. Then at the other corner, we see the European Union, also 27 countries, very diverse, and high intra-regional trade. 68% of the trade is intra-regional, and the labor force is vast. But then when we analyze the middle part is USMCA. So USMCA, only 3 countries and low intra-regional trade. So we observe this low intra-regional trade needs somebody. And who is this somebody? It's a growing dependence on Asia. So we see how USMCA is depending on Asia. And the lower value activities has been offshore to Asia. And South America, that traditionally was a partner, had to look opportunities in other regions. So you can see the following graph at the bottom, how the United States imports from Asia has been increasing a lot, but in the case of South America, has been flat and decreasing, okay? And then in the next one, in the next graphic, we see the South American main non-continental export partner. In the 2000s, you can see blue. It was mainly United States. But when we analyze in 2020, is China, the main partner of Latin America. So Latin America is Asia's largest extra-regional supplier of raw materials. The more North America depends on Asia, the deeper the trade relations between Asia and Latin America become. So now there is a window opportunity for North America to influence GVC reconfiguration and work with the Latin American countries. So if you turn the page, you will see how USMCA will look like with Latin American countries. And you see a more diverse set of countries that can participate in different segments of the value chain. What Latin America can offer: large and growing labor pool, abundant source of green energy, and also a major source of raw materials. So to enhance GVC manufacturing in America, several things are needed. First, for example, negotiate accumulation allowances across America, work in a comprehensive regional trade agreement, maybe start USMCA CAFTA or USMCA Pacific Alliance, then include Mercosur. Second, that was mentioned before, invest in upgrading in hard and soft infrastructure to connect the Americas. For example, it's more expensive. I was in Costa Rica, and it was more expensive to send a product from Costa Rica to Dominican Republic than Dominican Republic to China. And you see the distance. Third, lead workforce development to create capabilities for regional value chains. And fourth, prioritize the development on sustainable production chains in the region. So we observe a promising avenue to increase the regionalization within the Americas and working together as a continent.
Thank you.
Karina, thank you. That was a really great, concise summary of a really fascinating chapter. So thank you very much. And now you mentioned workforce development, which is a perfect lead-in to Ambassador Wayne.
Thank you, Andrew. But I'm going to take off starting where Karina was working. I think one of the very neat things about this book coming out now is that we are at a period of transition in globalization, and that globalization is intersecting with regionalism. And the real opportunities now are to take advantage of these changes. And I think we may be moving to a model of globalization that is regionalism and trusted partners, the two overlapping. And this book examines a lot of the topics that are needed to be looked at to make that succeed. And it's going to take work by all 3 of the countries in North America to actually further transition, make changes domestically between the 3 of them and with others as we go forward. So I'll add one more thing. Look through the table of contents here in this book. This has all sorts of the topics that it's really worth delving into for that transition, both for North America's prosperity, but also for being successful in the world as we move forward. So one of the areas that we've been working at for a while here at the Wilson Center is workforce development. And I partnered with a very good colleague from Mexico in writing this piece, and we talked to a number of colleagues in Canada where there are some really good programs on workforce development. And the interesting thing is, as was mentioned, workforce development is built into USMCA now. It's built into the high-level economic dialogue between the United States and Mexico, and it's built into the North American Leaders Summit agenda. And that's a massive change from where we were in 2018, 2019, when we first started saying, hey, we got to pay more attention to workforce development here. Why do you need to pay attention to that? Well, this was before the pandemic, so if the economy is changing with new technology coming in all the time, how are your workers going to learn if you don't start investing in, from the base up, and having a regular opportunity to upskill as you're going forward? And already at that time, the economies in North America were showing these gaps between the skills they needed and the people that had those skills. So we looked very carefully at this, and you can see this in this chapter, and we looked at 4 different areas where we think there could be a focus between the 3 governments. And to get to the bottom line first, what we say is the 3 governments should actually get together and form an umbrella under which all sorts of actors at the federal, subnational, and local levels, private sector and public, can get together in different groupings to learn from each other about what's working and to see how to move toward a more common approach to the issues. So one of the big issues is work-based learning. Most people know apprenticeships as one type, but it's only one type of this. There are all sorts of other ways that kids can still be in high school and be working and learning at the same time. There can be apprenticeships. There can be 2-week courses on the job. There can be 2-week courses with local junior colleges or universities, all sorts of ways that people are innovating and doing this. But we really aren't learning from each other. We have our own systems. In Canada, there is a national framework, but that national framework differs in every province. In the United States, there are a bunch of state frameworks, and there is one Labor Department framework, but they don't all match up. In Mexico, there are some very good skills programs and other things, but again, it's not spread across the country or across the continent. So people have different understandings of what they mean, what you learn in an apprenticeship. We think there's a lot of great work that could be done in taking that forward. And in that sense, I think the second area that we look at is the idea of credentials. So if you get this training, let's say you're in a great program and you get a certificate from it, is anybody else going to recognize that? Can you go to another province, another state, or even across the border and say, look, I have this training? And the employer will know that you have certain skills and you might be able to move, or the employer might be hiring you because of that. But right now we don't have that. We just have thousands of different credentials, and you have to guess sometimes. I mean, some of them we know well, but there are a lot of other ones that are good. So we need to work together to how do you define a credential that people can recognize and move forward. And if you do that well, that's going to help workers, companies, and localities in doing that. The third area we looked at is labor market data. So everybody's eyes should glaze over even further right now as I mentioned labor market data. But what it means is if we don't collect the right data, the same kind of data, and then make that available transparently so school counselors, students, employers, universities, all sorts of other people can get access to that data, then you don't really know what's happening in your market. And it is so important that we know that, given the rapidly changing skills that are required and the gaps that exist. So this is something that the governments could really do well together, getting together and standardizing the data they collect, the way it's shared and made available. And that would make a big difference, again, to a lot of people to actually know, should I go into this major? Should I take this credentials program or that credentials program? To a company, what's going to be coming down the line? What am I going to need in my area? And it's very surprising. A lot of CEOs, especially for small and medium enterprises, have no idea. They need the help of having this kind of data available. And then finally, we thought that because the change is so rapid, and then the pandemic really sped this up, technological changes, that there's really got to be some fora where people can share best practices of how things are working. Most of the best practices that we found in our studies were local. They're between local companies, local school districts, local universities, state-level officials or city-level officials. And that's where the real innovation was taking place and the good models are taking place. And the federal government might support it or they might not know about it. But if you don't have a way for people to learn across the country, but also across the continent, you're going to miss out on that. So the bottom line of all this is we thought we could really help our competitiveness as nations, as a continent. We could help our industries, which are so important, and we could help our workers, which we've learned in the last 15 years, if we neglect those workers, we pay all sorts of prices as a society, from them and their families and their communities to the political turmoil that sometimes follows when you don't pay attention to an important part of your community. So we think that all of this, it should really be a priority area for cooperation, and it's very good that it's in USMCA, that it's in the HLED, that it's in the NALS, but so far we're really just scratching the surface of the work that needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. I think that was great, and of the I think one of the most important parts of that chapter and of the book is that there are some concrete recommendations. I think we all know that telling policymakers we'd like to see more integration is not very effective, but describing exactly what we need gives them a roadmap. So, Tom, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Before I talk about North America and the world, which is my brief, I should say a word as co-editor of the book, because I've incurred many debts in helping to assemble this project, and I don't have time to thank everyone properly, but first and foremost, I want to express my appreciation to my co-editor, Alan Burson, and secondly to the many contributors to the volume who managed first a lot of delays followed by very tight deadlines to get this book out. I also have many debts here at Wilson, especially to Chris and to Andrew and their teams, Zoe, Samantha, Xavier, amongst others. And thank you very much to the ambassador and to DCM Cone for excellent opening remarks and incredibly relevant remarks. And I see that I'll be preaching to the choir here. So, where in the world is North America? When we look at the globe, of course, we see North America, but when we look at global politics, the place of North America is much less clear. Among world regions, North America is often overlooked, though not here at Wilson, of course. In other regions, summits of world leaders draw headlines and bright lights. In contrast, North America's summits have often been last-minute additions or fallen off the diplomatic calendar altogether, sometimes for years running. In Canada, Mexico, and the United States, political leaders rarely talk about North America, at least explicitly, and when they do, it's not always pretty. Politicians have distanced themselves from our shared regional home more readily than they've defended it. We rarely think of or study North America as a global region. Despite that, North America as we know it today emerged from a very specific global context, intimately connected to the fall of the Berlin Wall and integration in Europe. At that moment, it was a transformative proposal, if imperfect, one that moved towards embedding openness and institutionalizing cooperation instead of unilateralism. The region's relative stagnation after that first decade also owed to shifts in international politics, namely the tremendous growth of Chinese and Asian production and the far-flung U.S. response to the September 11th attacks. In that context, the region lost momentum, drifting, as the world around it changed. But today, as several others have already highlighted, the global deck is being reshuffled. A combination of factors, the uneven recovery from the pandemic, heightened competition with Russia and China, the urgent need for climate action, and an accumulation of transnational problems create urgent opportunities for North America. So, where do we go from here? As the book highlights, North America has tremendous potential to generate more inclusive growth across the region, as the ambassador also noted, to lead a climate response, to anchor global institutions in a time of change. North America is demographically incredibly dynamic, as one chapter highlights, but unless the region, and especially I think the United States, rethinks its approach to migration, we will surrender our demographic window. North America needs a more effective and coordinated approach, perhaps building on Canadian programs, that put people in positions to better their own conditions through labor mobility and real regional investments in workforce development, as Ambassador Wayne has explained. It is clear, of course, that North America has world-leading energy resources and green energy potential, but energy often remains a source of tension instead of being just a zone of cooperation, for some good reasons, of course. But at the moment, I'm afraid that North America, like much of the world, continues to lead the way down the highway to climate hell, in the UN Secretary General's words, more quickly than leading us on a road to sustainability. At an international level, we of course have peace amongst North America's countries. But for many people in North America, this strategic reserve is marred by profound social violence and dislocation. And this issue is not limited to Mexico, I hasten to add. When we respond to illicit markets, mostly by militarizing our borders and securitizing our relationships, we risk ceding the benefits gained by our Pacific international relations, handing our advantage instead to other regions. Without more inclusive and shared growth, North America is destined to face new waves of backlash. Without action on climate, we face even graver threats. In both cases, the survival of North America as we know it is far from assured. A clear message across several chapters in this book is that other parts of the world do not see North America as a coherent region, and they do not seek to engage with us as a region. And why should they, when our governments so rarely make the case for North America? And there have been real consequences to this. For example, in one chapter, Jorge Guajardo and Natalia Munoz write that, quote, as China grew more economically and politically powerful, North America became less relevant as a region. China does not see North America as a region, and indeed has benefited from the lack of a coordinated approach. In the words of another scholar, China was, quote, NAFTA's uninvited guest, interrupting the consolidation of North America's manufacturing sector. The disruptions and the tensions of the last few years suggest that there may have been a lot of wisdom in the North American road not taken. Today, it seems that North American interests regarding China are converging, but a joint approach is still lacking. North America's fragmented approach has also produced and embedded disadvantages in terms of relations with the European Union. In her chapter, Michelle Egan notes that there has been, quote, little thinking about how to leverage North America's negotiating power with third markets, such as the EU. Instead, Canada, Mexico, and the United States have engaged individually in competitive liberalization with a variety of other trade partners. As a consequence, Canada and Mexico risk being caught between and in an inefficient muddle of regulatory frameworks. In response, Egan highlights the need to better coordinate approaches to foreign investment from outside the region and to consolidate disparate trade frameworks. North America presents something of a paradox. Seen by its levels of trade and investment and social integration, North America is clearly as dynamic as any other region in the world. But if you were to just follow the words and actions of the region's leader, you might think North America barely exists. It is, as a scholar, Andrew Hurl, called North America, a region that dare not speak its name, something even more true in the wake of the transition from NAFTA to the USMCA, of course. Perhaps the absence of attention, the absence of speaking North America does not matter. The region's economic heft, world-leading trade, and leadership of global value chains all speak for themselves. But in my view, without defenders who envision the region's place in the world, North America is destined to be blamed for real problems that exist while getting little credit for the benefits created. Calls for greater North American cooperation are often dismissed by skeptics, those who say North America is not Europe and the EU approach won't work here. And I agree. No one in this volume, if you look through it, is proposing a North American Union. And if there's one thing that scholars of regionalism have learned, it's that EU institutions are not one size fits all. So instead, let's start by highlighting and building upon the ties that we have. Let's make the North America Leaders Summit a consistent priority, backed by sustained and increasing intergovernmental implementation and review efforts. Because North American issues cut across borders and bureaucracies, this effort should seek to strengthen the already existing links between the three governments that we've already heard about. It should be closely connected, of course, with the ongoing USMCA Free Trade Commission and the Competitiveness Committee, but let's also link NOLS with parallel civil society and private sector networks. Of course, many of these connections do exist, but I'd argue they need a vision, in orientation, priorities, and salience if North America is to thrive. So if we are to seize this opportunity presented by a moment of tremendous global change, we must start looking at the world through a North American lens that will help us envision and achieve our long-term, and I think often shared, national interests. Thank you.
Tom, thank you, and thank all of you. Really great presentations. Tom, you did a fantastic job, really sort of bringing in a lot of the authors who weren't here today. So thank you for that. With Chris's indulgence, we'll stretch just a minute or two. Maybe what I'll do is pose one general question to the three of you with little tweaks, and then I'll let you respond. You can respond to that or other things. You of course all talked about North America and how we promote it and what is it or what is it not. So, Karina, I think one thing that I found interesting about your chapter is the argument you make. It makes a lot of sense that essentially North America needs the rest of Latin America to fill a role that is filled within Europe and Asia, which are bigger trade agreements or bigger regions than ours. So my thought for you or question for you is whether the change in politics in South America impede that. When we originally probably conceived of this book, you were thinking, or you mentioned the Pacific Alliance, and which is different now because of the leadership, particularly in Chile and Colombia. Ambassador Wayne, one of the things you mentioned that has always, I think, been a struggle is so much of certification is done at the state level in the U.S., and maybe, I'm not sure, at the provincial level in Canada. So any thoughts you might share on how do you overcome that so that somebody who gets a degree in Mexico or Canada can, let's say, practice nursing in 3 different U.S. states, since they all have their own criteria? And Tom, you addressed some of this already, but one thing that it comes up all the time is we never think of ourselves as North American. And you mentioned there are lots of institutions. So maybe my question is, do we need that? Do we need to create a North American identity? Or if we do what you suggested of just sort of building on the institutions, does it sort of happen without any of us having to call ourselves North American? And we'll go in the same order if we could. And I'll ask you, I wasn't brief, but I'll ask you to be brief.
Thank you, Andrew, for your question. Yes, definitely the changing politics is important. However, when we think about all these mini-regional groups, for example, CAFTA-DR or Pacific Alliance or Mercosur, all these groups, they need a market, and they do understand that the US, Canada, and Mexico, they are huge markets, so they will see it on their advantage. and is governments are open to continue the conversations to join. Everybody knows that they have been they have been trying, and it's difficult, but they have to continue harder because it's going to be a win-win for both, for North America and the rest of the groups. I think the smarter thing will be started by Pacific Alliance, that is the group more open to collaborate and join forces.
Thank you. Please, Ambassador Wayne.
I will get to your point. I want to just on this, as you might all have noted, that the United States proposed a new economic partnership for the Americas. Basically, it's a title waiting to be filled in. So there's a great opportunity here to start filling it in. We're clearly not going to be, from the United States point of view, jumping into new free trade agreements. But there are a number of things that were mentioned as potential topics that could help bring people together. So one of the opportunities is to start filling that in a way that could build closer connections in a number of these key areas. That won't be easy, but there's a big space for creative economic diplomacy here. Secondly, certifications. Certifications is going to remain really complex. It's really complex. I remember back working on U.S.-EU relations and how complex it was, because we do have this private sector and state-by-state certification of a number of standards. But the only way you can get going on it is if you bring people together. And federal governments can do that. They might not be able to control everything, but they have convening power. In Canada, they've done this. They don't control still the apprenticeship programs and other things, but they have brought people together. They put things in legislation. We do that also in the United States. In Mexico, in a number of instances, they have some of the legislation. It's then a question of, is it being implemented and how is it being used and being updated? So you could do this. It would take a 5 to 10 year effort of investing in this, but given the importance of having workers that have the right sets of skills, and it relates to another chapter in the book, which is education cooperation also, because you really have to start giving people skills by having a partner of the universities or the tecnológicos or the community colleges or whatever, starting to give the courses that teach the skills that the businesses nearby need. And so if you don't join this effort together, you're not going to get anywhere. If you start joining it together, it's still going to take you a long time because, as many of us know, universities don't change really quickly, but a number of them are already sort of on their own. And those would be the best practices that you'd want others to learn from. So there's a lot you can start doing, realizing it's going to be a long road.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. You know, there's been some polling done about the idea of whether there's a North American identity, probably for the longest time by CIDE, the México, las Américas y el Mundo surveys, and very few people will identify first as North Americans. A few more will accept it as sort of a secondary identity. But your question is sort of about whether it's necessary, and I don't think that identifying as North Americans, and certainly not replacing national identity, which I think is a bit far-fetched, is necessary to improve the way that we cooperate with one another. I do think that we need to be very careful about identifying ourselves in opposition to our neighbors. We need to identify the ways in which the problems, the challenges that we faced cannot just be blamed on the neighbor, right? But that they are so intrinsically interrelated, that so many of the problems that we face are interwoven amongst our societies and our governments. And so if we identify shared interest, I don't think we necessarily need to identify ourselves primarily or even secondarily as North Americans. Though I'd welcome it, I guess.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel. Great conversation. We're going to turn it over to our second panel, and maybe Chris will be better at taking some audience questions than I was. Not to put too much pressure on him. But thank you all. Let's give the panel a round of applause.
Well, welcome everybody. This is our second panel, a chance to take another dive into some of the topics that are covered in the book, North America 2.0, Forging a Continental Future. Really glad to have a chance to delve into topics with Daniela Stevens, Gaetan Uhl, and Inu Manek. The biographies are in the book and, of course, also on the website, so I won't, in the spirit that Andrew challenged me to make sure there was time for questions, I won't go on, but I will go to our speakers. And what I'd like to do maybe is start with you, Inu.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I'm really glad to be here and to see so many familiar faces, and really proud of the output that we put together in this book. And my thanks to Tom and Alan for doing so much to bring it to its conclusion so we can share it with everybody else going forward. So my chapter in this volume is North America Interrupted, Trade, Politics, and a Stunted Continental Vision. I look at the renegotiation of the NAFTA, which I argue moved us one step forward and 2 steps back towards North American integration. In fact, the negotiations revealed the longstanding challenges and the weaknesses of NAFTA, though likely not the ones that I think most folks might think of. On the positive side, we were able to restore state-to-state dispute settlement and include a new chapter on good regulatory practice, which embeds the successful efforts that existed outside of NAFTA and brought them into the fold. There's also a new chapter on digital trade to make this agreement more 21st century. But on the other hand, USMCA also solidified dual bilateralism, as was strikingly obvious during negotiations. At one point, I'm sure you all remember, Ambassador Lighthizer threatened to go ahead on a deal alone with Mexico. The negotiations rehashed a lot of the same criticism that had been lobbed against the North American integration project in the final stage of NAFTA's ratification, and in the subsequent years that leaders sought to build on that in the Americas. So NAFTA is still a bad word, actually. We don't really mention it very much. In fact, in the first panel, I didn't really hear it brought up most often. It was USMCA, right? And this is despite the fact that NAFTA has been responsible for tremendous economic success. I don't think we say that often enough. $2.6 billion traded every minute. 1 trillion annually. That is a success. And yet, we don't hear those figures being parroted by our politicians. North America makes up 14% of global merchandise exports, and we continue to make things together. The fact that almost 50% of our exports stay within the region is evidence of that fact. Yet, if you listen to NAFTA's detractors, you would believe Trump's common retort that NAFTA was the worst deal ever negotiated, although he also said TPP was that. So I'm not sure which one he thought was the worst. But despite that, this is simply false. This rhetoric triumphed in propelling the renegotiation along, but thankfully, we managed to preserve a deal among the 3 partners in the end. Losing NAFTA would have been far more disastrous than the outcome we actually achieved. At the same time, we also missed the opportunity to craft a continental vision for trade and to improve NAFTA's institutional deficit. This was, however, by design, and it's unfortunate that we repeated the same mistakes yet again. Instead, the 2 defining forces of North American integration reigned supreme: asymmetry and ambivalence. Because of that, integration suffered a setback with the USMCA, but that does not mean that this is a permanent state of being. In fact, Canada, Mexico, and the United States have regularly experienced periods of turbulence, followed by cooperation. Through crisis, we have found many opportunities to strengthen our bonds and chart new ways forward on shared challenges. But beneath the surface, we always remain highly suspicious about each other's motives. And this anxiety, I think, was most pronounced during the course of the USMCA negotiations, where Chrystia Freeland lamented the United States' winner-takes-all mentality and the efforts that the United States made to weaken the pact. Now, the new auto rules of origins are a case in point, though what we ended up with is far better than the original proposals that were put forward that would have been far more restrictive. The new rules will still weaken the industry's global competitiveness. Then, Mexico, historically the fiercest champion of North American integration, made a large sacrifice at the 11th hour to close the deal for all three of us. There have now been 5 rapid response mechanism petitions pursued by USTR, which the United States has championed as delivering exceptional results, but I would say the verdict is still out on this. And we also have to think about lack of transparency and challenges with due process that remain that could harm long-term cooperation between the United States and Mexico going forward. If we look at the US objective on renegotiating the NAFTA, it was to rebalance the trade relationship. But we may have ended up injecting greater imbalance and unpredictability into North America's economic future. So what is then the way forward? The Biden administration's largest challenge, I think, coming from the US perspective, and I'll speak from both US and Canadian perspectives because I get two and both. I think for Biden, the challenge is not making the case for continental cooperation, but rather in distancing himself from Trump's approach to North America and to trade. In fact, we know Biden's views. He has been a strong supporter of continental trade for years. In fact, in a 2013 speech he gave at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico City, he stated, and I quote, "There is no question that our economic partnership has been a success. But there is also no question that there's much, much, much more potential." And he did say much 3 times. And he said, I would add, "There's also no question, lest we seize the opportunity, it may pass us by because the world is moving rapidly." And he wrapped up his comments by saying, "From Canada to the tip of Argentina, there is no reason why in the 21st century the hemisphere will not be the most potent economic engine in the world." I have not heard him say that since he's been president, but I hope someone reminds him that he said this at one point. I think that this vision that he outlined in 2013 is the bold, inclusive, and continental vision that should be the lodestar for cooperation in North America today. So how do we get there? Tom stole some of my thunder, but I'll say I can add to that, and so thank you for what you said. I'm also a former student of Bob Pastor, so you're not going to be surprised to hear that I'm going to say we need to think really big. And the first thing we need to do is to uphold our commitments to trade liberalization, and then take it further. I think we still have challenges here in erecting barriers to trade, and then there's a lot of barriers from regulatory divergence, which the previous panel talked about. It's time to take on this tyranny of small differences. Second, we need to consider the creation of a North American investment fund that can finance border infrastructure and cross-border transportation projects. With so much trade happening by road, we need to ensure that we coordinate our efforts on improving the infrastructure at our border. This can also help with the green transition, and money should go towards that for continental efforts. Third, our institutions must rise to the challenge. The Free Trade Commission should meet at least once a year, but also include other government officials aside from the trade ministers. For example, when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, why did we not convene a meeting of the FTC to figure out how we would deal with transportation bottlenecks at the border, getting trucks through customs clearance, and then also just on our COVID policies at the border? How come we did not coordinate on that? There was an opportunity here, and we had the infrastructure, but we did not use it. So you'd think we'd learned the lessons from 9/11, but I think COVID showed us that we did not. Fourth, I think we need to take steps to bring down barriers to the North American community so that we stop seeing our neighbors as foreigners, but instead as friends. I think one way to do this is to establish something similar to the European Union's Erasmus program so that students from all 3 countries can have the opportunity to study in either. And before you call this unrealistic, I'll remind you that Vice President Biden suggested something very similar as a student exchange program between the United States and Mexico. And I'm sure that when Canada finds out, they're going to want to join too. So maybe we should pursue this. Finally, and perhaps the boldest and most difficult, which others have touched upon, is to improve labor mobility. This was what NAFTA, I think, failed to imagine. But the reality of our economic and personal links across the borders make this a necessity for our long-term competitiveness and prosperity. So let me just conclude by making one final observation. That when we talk about regional identity and integration, I think that it's easy to get caught up in the limitations that politics places on deepening cross-border ties. But North America's long-term future has never been tied to whoever is the occupant in the White House. The whoever is there obviously leaves their mark. Ultimately, that is because the region is not about rules, it's about people. And trade may have helped bring us together, but it is those relationships that we have built among each other that allow us time and again to transcend those lines on the map that seemingly divide us. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Getahu.
Thank you very much. Chapter 11 of the book is not about bankruptcies. It's about cybersecurity, but few companies that are subject to attacks have gone bankrupt, so I guess it's aligned. To start my little speech, I'd like to maybe refer to some statistics from a survey that was conducted this year by the Ponemon Institute amongst 550 organizations that were hit by a massive data breach. The average loss of from a data breach, when we take into account the legal fees, forensic fees, the loss of business, loss of sales, etc., is staggering. In the USA, we're looking at an average of $9.4 million per data breach per company. In Canada, 5.6. In Latin America, 2.6. Why such a variation? Well, it's clear. The more your organization depends on technology to do its business, the bigger the impact if you're hit by a data breach. It's pretty straightforward. Another interesting element from the survey is that on average, these 550 organizations took 277 days to identify and correct the problem. So that means it's not one of those little random attacks. It's been planned. The attackers were there long ago to try to exfiltrate information, and it took forever for these people to identify, oh my God, we're under siege here. Something's happening. Moreover, when the organization was attacked indirectly because their critical supplier had been breached, it took an extra 26 days to recover from such an attack. So this leads us to issues of interconnectivity, not just within our countries, but with Canada, Mexico, and the USA. Since 1994, the signature of the free trade agreement between the three countries, our economies are more intertwined than ever, and our industries depend on one another, namely our manufacturing supply chain, food supply chain, energy, telecom. Just to give an example, I don't know if you remember the 2003 power outage. It started with a software bug at a control room at a company called First Energy in Akron, Ohio. That bug triggered a power failure with a ripple effect across the Northeast USA and the entire province of Ontario. The outage lasted 7 hours, only 7 hours, but impacted 50 million people and had an impact on the economy by the tune of $6 billion. This was a software bug. It could have very well been a cyber attack. Typical cyber attack take much more than 7 hours to fix. So imagine the impact that this could have had on our countries. So all that to say that a cyber attack in Canada could have consequences in the States, in Mexico, and vice versa. So what are we doing about it? Well, one of the best approach to protect against cyber attacks is, first of all, figuring out who's trying to attack us and which techniques are they using to attack us. So in the States, they're using they have 24 or 25 Information Sharing Analysis Center, or called ISACs. They're aligned with various industries, medical, energy, high tech, etc. Very effective, except that they're siloed by industry. And only members can share information among members. You cannot share with another ISAC, and you definitely cannot share it with other countries. In Mexico, the cyber information exchange is progressing, but generally still rather uncoordinated. In Canada, from a population we're 10 times smaller than USA, having an ISAC per industry just did not make any sense. So what was created is the Canadian Centre for Threat Exchange, which essentially we get feeds from governments at the federal, provincial, municipal level, from industries, regardless of the industry, and we also get feeds input from various international hubs that are into the cyber threat information sharing business. We had a brainstorming session, the three authors of this chapter, as to, okay, what's the way forward? It's one thing to sort of scare everybody with these numbers, but what's the way forward? And instead of starting from a blank piece of paper, we all agree that maybe one thing that we should do is expand the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange concept into a North American one, where everybody chips in, regardless whether you're Mexican, American, or Canadian, whether you're in the healthcare business or energy sector, whether you're government or private sector, etc. You put all your information in there, and you analyze it. The CCTX in Canada is a nonprofit organization. It did not require layers and layers and layers of policy and government approval and so on. It just was somebody's bright idea, put it together, everybody agreed, and within a year, it was in place and people started to add to it. Something that we could, I think, do when I look at all the recommendations from other speakers and here and the authors of the book. It's all heavy lifting. The CCTX, my opinion, is a low-hanging fruit that would not require much time and energy to put in place, but would have so much positive return for all three countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now to Daniela Stevens.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here at the Wilson Center, where too many years ago I was an intern for the Mexico Institute, so I'm happy to be back here. I also appreciate the opportunity to be part of this stellar lineup of authors and editors of the book. Many thanks to Tom, to Alan, and to my co-author that's here in the audience, Mariana Sanchez Ramirez. So the task that we had with the environment chapter was to assess how far we've come since NAFTA, what's changed, and whether regional cooperation has lived up to current times, where we have overwhelming evidence of environmental deterioration and, of course, of the climate crisis. And the short answer is no. No, but there have been some modest changes that protect biodiversity and encourage environmental protection in general. So today, I'd like to discuss two main points. First, I want to highlight issues that the USMCA's Chapter 24 covers that were overlooked in the past. There was some innovation in institutional arrangements and a few provisions. And second, I'd like to outline missed opportunities, particularly regarding climate change, and identify ways in which the three partners can use the text of the USMCA to advance climate mitigation, even though it's not part of the agreement. So beginning with innovations. The first is related to transparency, to institutional transparency. The chapter created an environment committee in charge of providing information on implementation and streamlining data collection and reporting. The agreement requires that all decisions and reports are available to the public, which is a notable improvement for transparency, because under NAFTA, reports were not accessible unless 2/3 of the council voted to make them publicly available. The Environment Committee held its first meeting in 2021. It just held its second meeting on September of 2022. And partners indeed underscore the importance of public information, public awareness of environmental issues, and it's also important to mention that the Environment Committee holds public consultations in every one of its meetings. The USMCA also included 3 new provisions: increased enforcement of wildlife trafficking, marine litter, and food waste. Parties agreed to treat transnational trafficking of protected wildlife as a serious crime, with a punishment of at least 4 years of incarceration. The USMCA is the first trade deal, the first, to establish that signatories must take measures to prevent and reduce marine plastic pollution. The agreement doesn't mention explicit measures, let alone how efforts would be funded, but it provides a solid start. And as I said, it's pioneering in these efforts to reduce marine litter. The third provision regarding food waste seeks to promote sustainable consumption and sustainable production of food. But a consequence of reducing food waste is to reduce emissions of methane, a greenhouse gas, which in turn contributes to the fight against climate change. Other notable improvements in the USMCA's Chapter 24 include that the environment is actually included in the body of the agreement, not as a side agreement, not as an afterthought. A consideration of the relevance of the environment for indigenous populations, acknowledging their constitutional rights, and pointing out the importance of consulting with them on efforts to enhance environmental collaboration. Also, a pioneering provision on gender that mandates that the Secretariat should develop recommendations on how to best consider gender and diversity in the implementation of the Environmental Work Program. Now, in any trade agreement, there are provisions not included in the environmental chapter that nonetheless are very impactful on the environment and on climate. And here I mainly want to refer to the Investor-State Dispute Settlement, the ISDS, which is, as you know, an arbitration mechanism that allows companies to pursue claims against the host state when this host state allegedly breached a standard in the agreement. The goal is to encourage foreign investment by signaling that there is a predictable and a stable environment and there is an impartial system of arbitration. However, in the past, ISDS procedures have raised some suspicions about advancing business interest over states' environmental regulations. The system was used under NAFTA to sue governments and challenge domestic environmental stipulations to favor investors who invoked the national treatment standard. Chapter 11 of NAFTA disincentivized state enhancement of regulations given this desire to avoid litigation and to avoid potential losses. And it created, in turn, incentives for investors to obtain high payouts invoking ISDS arbitration. So under NAFTA, parties could effectively offshore production to countries with weaker standards. The USMCA limited the ISDS to so that the 3 parties can only bring claims arising out of unfair trade procedures, not of unfair environmental regulations. This is a major step forward because in the past, the ISDS was invoked to challenge regulations including phasing out coal-based electricity generation, banning radioactive waste disposal at sea, and preventing the export of toxic waste. So this is indeed good news. Moving on to the missed opportunities, which is what I think has garnered more attention and with a reason. The USMCA entirely ignores climate change, does not mention mitigation, adaptation, or the Paris Agreement whatsoever. It doesn't mention other critical issues that have a direct impact on climate change, such as fossil fuel subsidies. It doesn't discuss the fossil fuel production cuts necessary to meet climate goals. It also ignores important concepts and objectives in the fight against climate change, such as the energy transition, low or zero carbon economies and technologies, and adaptation to protect vulnerable communities. Negotiators, as you know, didn't rise to the task, partially because the time was not politically ripe. Negotiations were fragile, to say the least, and this was a delicate issue that could have stalled progress. In 2018, we witnessed a turn to protectionism, the former president's denial of climate change. But there are some glimpses of hope in the treaty. Chapter 24, for example, does highlight the importance of trade and investment in clean technologies. It promotes the use of carbon storage. It mentions these technologies as part of the shoulds and the coulds and not as binding obligations. So these are all areas where North American leaders should urgently expand trilateral mechanisms, and there is an opportunity to do it at the upcoming summit. Not only to address shared problems, but to own collective responsibility as being part of the largest emitters in the world. It was a sign of the times, but caveats about national sovereignty in Chapter 24 are even stronger than in NAFTA's environmental side agreements. These caveats include the right to exercise discretion in enforcement, priority setting, resource allocation. The chapter leaves to the discretion of each party the form and the extent of environmental protection, against a missed opportunity to forge a continental vision for environmental protection. In the chapter, we focused on the electrification of transportation as a, yes, a low-hanging fruit, but one that could be nonetheless very impactful in the joint fight against climate change. And we make a few recommendations about electromobility, creating green hubs. Finally, I would like to close by saying that it is a bit discouraging to see that the commitment to enforce environmental laws only applies when these laws do not discourage trade or investment. With that said, there are untapped areas of potential and language in the USMCA that the three partners could use to collaborate in the fight against climate change, and I'd be happy to discuss them in the Q&A alongside other comments and any questions that you may have. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. And I think if you haven't read the book yet, you have, in these three speakers, a very good sense of the book. It will terrify you with all the things that could have gone wrong or could still go wrong, but leaves you ultimately, and I think this is the theme throughout the book, with the hope that we can do better, that we can resolve these things, and we'll get it right eventually. Now I want to turn to all of you. You'll see here, Quinlan, there, Tomas, with microphones. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll try to get the microphone to you as quickly as we can. Pause so that you can speak in the microphone because we do have a recording underway. Gentleman here.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Justin from the Quebec office, and I'm wondering, so in 2026, there will be a NAFTA or USMCA review. What can stakeholders like the Wilsons, like think tanks and industry can do to prepare for that review? And how would you suggest, what changes would you suggest that they start to think about now to make to the accord?
Would you like to try that?
Yeah.
Anu?
You know, the sunset clause, originally the poison pill of NAFTA, I think a good way to think about it is it's an opportunity to rethink what we put in there and how we can improve. And I do think that there's a lot of preparation that should be going into this, that should begin at the North American Leader Summit, identifying the priorities that we need to cooperate on, and then taking that forward by making sure that we have very broad-based consultations, not just in the government level, but the subnational level, and then also with our private sector stakeholders. You know, at the end of, what was it, the Smart Borders Initiative, we had a lot of work, I know you've written a lot about that, Chris, how we had a lot more cooperation after 9/11 and thinking about how we needed to involve a broad base of stakeholder input and trying to figure out our shared problems. I think we need to get back to that way of thinking and really go from the ground up, right? But I think that, you know, some priorities, obviously we need to have better planning for future pandemics. That should be number one on the agenda. We need to figure out how to make our supply chains a little bit more resilient. And we also need to think about how we can improve and enhance our trading relationship by avoiding things like the Inflation Reduction Act, where we later have to deal with, you know, trying to sort out the mess that potentially was created by Congress, but Canada and Mexico likely, they intervened just in time, which was good. But we need to think about planning ahead. And Daniela mentioned in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation, climate change should be on the agenda, and things like what was in the Inflation Reduction Act is something we need to be talking about in terms of how we coordinate on these among the three governments in the future.
Daniela, that's a perfect opportunity. Do you think that some of your agenda will make it on in 2026?
I think so. I think that with a change of leadership, it's very highly going to be in the agenda. And also with the approval of the Inflation Reduction Act, there is ample opportunity to engage the region. On the one hand, yes, the Inflation Reduction Act is a somewhat inward-looking piece of legislation, but it does include provision to encourage, for example, manufacture of electric vehicles. With the CHIPS Act, it includes the opportunity to encourage semiconductor investment in Mexico. So I think those are golden opportunities. And regarding your question, I think the role of think tanks and our role as part of a think tank world is to be ready. Be ready before our decision makings are. Be ready with the data, with the expertise, so that when they're ready, we have all the arguments, all the data to inform a better course of action.
Gaetan, can I turn it to you? Do we have time to wait until 2026 to deal with some of the cybersecurity cooperation that you, opportunities that you highlighted, or do we need to do that sooner?
We've been trying to do this forever, it seems. There needs to be, all at the workers' level, they all agree.
Right.
There seems to be a bit of a paralysis at the upper echelon as to all kinds of political reasons why this cannot happen. But again, the simplicity of the CCTX model, again, it's a non-profit organization. The initial president and CEO was a former assistant deputy minister from Public Safety Canada. He had a strong network of contacts, and he had this bright idea when he decided to retire, and up it went. And everybody over time ended up, sure, yeah, I'll jump in. So people pay minimal fee to be a member. Those who can contribute information do so. The others just take whatever they need and so on. Very, very simple, very easy to implement. We do not need this high-level discussions between, no. This can be done at the workers' level, really.
Fantastic. Audience questions? Gentleman to that side.
Hi, just first of all, incredible discussion. Have not read the book, but I will now, okay? just fantastic. My name's Eric Lee. I have a consulting firm, but before that I was the global electrification strategist for Stellantis, which used to be FCA and all that. And so everything you discussed, I was living. Because we had footprints in Canada and Mexico, and one of you cited the $1 trillion a year. I was thinking we had probably at least 10, 15 billion in just capital investment there, and also in Canada. So all these things are real world, day to day. I mean, maybe esoteric at a policy level, but incredibly impactful on employment and productivity, and the point that a lot of these things that are made in these regions are sold within these regions, right? But Karina brought up the point of this Americas concept, and that one graphic you have that shows a 20-year difference of the relationship of the North America with China. I mean, to me, that's a gobsmack of reality on what happens, and it's one step removed. It's not tic-tac-toe, maybe it's checkers, but the more we lean on China, it appears the more they lean on South America for the resources of the things we're buying out of China, right? And I just wonder, with this 2026 MCA revisiting, and I know that it would probably be just an immense challenge, but the concept of expanding to more of an America's look, a hemispherical look to this, is that something that you think would ever gain traction? Because I know it probably muddy up the water quite a bit, and it's hard enough just to get 3 countries to dance together. So I'd just be curious if anybody's got any kind of opinion on that.
Thoughts on this? I would turn to you, Inu, because I know we've often talked about accession clauses and how these things can expand, but NAFTA ended up being all the countries having bilateral agreements with countries like Chile. Do you think that this USMCA can expand, and will we just keep adding letters?
Oh gosh, that'd be a mouthful at a conference. I hope not, for that reason. It is an interesting question, because there's always been this tug, like when we wanted to consider the free trade area of the Americas, right? There was sort of opposition, even in Canada, to expanding further south. Canada has probably the most ambivalence towards, being seen as hemispheric, in its orientation. And I think that's a big challenge. The way I see this most vividly right now is when Secretary Blinken was up in Canada, Justin Trudeau asked to be part of the IPEF, which makes sense in a sense because,
IPEF being?
The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I'm sorry, I'm around trade people too much. But he asked to be in the IPEF agreement because it's sort of the Biden administration's answers to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump withdrew us from. Now, what's interesting is the fact that it makes sense because Canada is also a very Pacific country, but Mexico is too. So Mexico should be part of those discussions. But then we also have this America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, which Tony brought up. And I think that's where a real opportunity lies to think regionally in a big way. The hard thing is going to be keeping Canada very focused on the Americas and not so focused on Asia. Bob Pastor talked about this forever and complained a lot that Canada was not the trusted partner in the hemisphere. I think things are changing, but the APEP is the way to kind of lock Canada into that framework. And so we have to define what we can do there. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but that's how we can improve, I think, our continental orientation. And we should, for all the reasons you cite, because the reality is people live and work on this hemisphere. And unfortunately, the United States has not invested enough in thinking hemispherically. It's always thinking outwards, beyond what's right in front of us, and we need to change that.
Gaetan, let me ask you a little bit about the digital backbone. We don't talk a lot about service trade, but it's a huge part of our North American trade. Can that extend through the hemisphere? Do you think that there's a natural infrastructure link with, for example, Central America, which is right on the margins, or other major parts of the hemisphere?
Well, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. The more your footprint increases from a network perspective, the more your attack surface increases and you become more vulnerable to attack. So it's a two-edged sword.
Yep.
So you have, in cyber, you have to pick your partners very carefully. More and more companies now have all kinds of security criteria in the contract when they want to establish a partnership with their critical suppliers, because if you have a critical supplier that is a victim of a cyber attack, then you're indirectly impacted. In Canada, just this past spring, a company called Sunwing ended up being 2 weeks without being unable to operate. Why? Because the company that was managing the management of the seats for the passengers got breached.
Wow.
And again, that company that was breached, not a multi-billion-dollar company, but it was an essential ingredient for the operation of Sunwing. And they had not done their due diligence as to whether or not that small company was more resilient to cyber attacks. So again, extending to all kinds of countries, yes, but there are conditions obviously in there to make sure that yes, you do your own your homeworks to secure yourself.
Karina, I wonder if you could pick up on this theme and address whether we could have a North American common front on some of these environmental issues globally. Obviously, the environment doesn't have borders, and China matters, Europe matters, et cetera. But could the North American countries approach climate change and other environmental issues as a group? Is there potential for a block here?
Well, I usually speak about climate issues, so I hate to bring to be the bearer of bad news in most of these fronts. But if you remember the Kyoto Protocol in the 90s, that protocol started a very real but very unproductive division between the developed and the developing world. And countries have made use of that division to, on the one hand, say, well, we don't have any responsibility. We are developing. We have the right to still be emitters. That would be Mexico in the North American front. And on the other hand, countries like Mexico, like the United States, like Canada, that would have the responsibility as historical emitters, have also been resistant to the idea arguing that it's a collective effort, that the whole world should participate. So there is this very clear division within the North American partners that unfortunately would not allow them to create a front. We can see that on COP27. That started this week. Countries come to COP27 with very uneven agendas, focusing on different issues. On the one hand, Mexico has nothing to bring to the table in terms of mitigation. Mexico will very likely focus on issues like adaptation, like finance for the developing world. And the United States is not coming to the table empty-handed like it was last year. It approved the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a turning point in climate mitigation. And it's something that Mexico cannot commit to. Last week on November 2nd, John Kerry, the Special Envoy for Climate, announced that Mexico would announce a large mitigation commitment before the COP. To my knowledge, it has not announced it. My hunch is that it had to do with creating a green hub at the border in the state of Sonora. But even in the bilateral relation, the North American partners unfortunately do not see eye to eye.
Plenty of work to do. Other questions from the audience? Time for at least one more. Uncharacteristically shy. Well, with that then, I'm going to do two things. First, I want to thank this panel, a tremendous set of presentations, not only solid presentations, but also great chapters in the book. The book is strong because of your commitments. I appreciate that very much. I also want to thank some of the people Tom Long mentioned early on. This has been a collaboration not only between Andrew Redmond and myself, it also has drawn on really tremendous efforts from Zoe Reed, from Cecily Fasanella, from Samantha Kane, who was helpful. And we have former Wilson colleagues like Diego Marroquin and Mariana Sanchez Ramirez, who've been part of this from the beginning. So it's been a long journey, but we're really glad to have so many people who have helped to make this book great, particularly, if I may say, with no insult meant to you, Gaetan. It's been inspiring to see how generally young the visionary authors are here.
No insult taken.
We have a lot of great contributors, and I think they point to a great future for this conversation. So now it falls. I have one last thing I'd like to do. You've heard his name several times, but he has been hiding up in the row. I want to invite Alan Burson, the other co-editor of this book, to come up and to tell us a little bit about this vision.
Chris said it well. This has been a terrific snapshot of what is in the book and of the agenda that it projects for North America. This project got started in 2017, 5 years ago. And we launched it and conceived it as a group because we thought that North America was under unjustified attack. And although it had always been a political piñata, it was really at a point of challenge we had not seen because of the virulence of and the ugliness of the rhetoric. But think about what's happened in the last 5 years. Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the pivot of China away from the West and vice versa, the pandemic, and now the splintering of the world order and its global supply chains. So in fact, this book actually takes on it retains its relevance, and the authors have been terrific. They had original insight and they've updated it, but it is particularly relevant at a time when we should acknowledge that the American century, in fact, has come to an end. But rather than being a cause for further political division in this country and sadness, we should recognize that we're on the verge of a North American century that is just beginning. And it is altogether fitting and proper that young people have taken the lead in generating this volume. So let me thank, again, the Wilson Institute, Aspen, Mexico, the University of Victoria, the Belfer Center at Harvard that were co-sponsors with Wilson of this effort, and again to the authors, and particularly to Tom Long, who took it over the finish line when we thought that we had fumbled the ball. So thank you very much, and thank you again for this wonderful presentation.
Class dismissed.